The wine arrives first, then the food. Roasted boar, honeyed dates, platters of oysters still glistening. Music. You're seated, 3 cushions from the Emperor of Rome. Your wife sits, music, beside you. Your daughter, barely 16, adjusts her staller nervously across the table. The room fills with senators, generals, their families. Everyone who matters in the empire is here, and then Caligula stands. He doesn't toast, he doesn't announce anything. He walks slowly around the table, past the consuls, past the prefects, past men who command legions. He stops behind your daughter. His hand rests on her shoulder. He says 5 words to you, not to her. The room doesn't gasp. No one moves because everyone here has already learned what you're learning now. In this palace, objection is music, permission to die. So you do what every father in this room has done. You smile, you nod, you watch her leave with him. And when she returns an hour later, silent, pale, adjusting her dress, you pour more wine and pretend you saw nothing because Rome just taught you. The empire doesn't care what you saw. It cares what you're willing to forget. If this is the history they don't teach in schools, the documented truth they hoped you'd never find, then subscribe now because we keep uncovering these stories one by one. No sugarcoating, just the raw truth. What happened in these rooms didn't make it into most history books, but the records exist. If you're here because silence, music, shouldn't erase documented history, then stay. We're going back inside. In 37 AD, when music gassed Julius Caesar, Augustus Geminus took power. Rome didn't crown a stranger, they crowned a legacy. His father, Germanicus, had been the most beloved general in Roman history. Crowds wept at his funeral. Riots broke out when whispers spread that Tiberius had him poisoned. His mother, Agrena the Elder, descended directly from Augustus. She'd accompanied Germanicus on campaigns, standing beside soldiers in Germania while pregnant. Their children represented everything Rome told itself it still was: discipline, nobility, military tradition, divine ancestry. When Tiberius finally died, the Music Senate didn't deliberate. They offered the purple to Gas, nicknamed Caligula, little boots from the miniature legionary sandals he wore as a child among the troops. He was 24 years old. Rome erupted in music, celebration. Political prisoners were released. Gladiatorial games were funded. Music. The granaries were opened. Taxes were reduced. Suetonius records that over 160,000 animals, music, were sacrificed in the first 3 months of celebration alone. For 7 months, it felt like the dark years under Tiberius were over. Then Caligula collapsed. October 37 AD, the emperor fell into fever so severe that priests, music, were dispatched to every temple in the city. Senators pledged their lives to the gods if he survived. One, Antonius Music Secundus, even vowed to fight as a gladiator if the emperor recovered. Foe of Alexandria records that the entire empire held music, its breath. Grain shipments stalled, markets closed, messengers rode day and night between Rome and the provinces, carrying updates. For days he lingered between consciousness and death, and when he woke, the records fracture music here. Suetonius, Cassius Dio, Fellow, Seneca. All of them note the change, but none explain it. Some claim brain fever. Others suggested poisoning. Modern historians have speculated epilepsy, infinitus hypothyroidism, but diagnosis doesn't matter. What matters is the man who opened his eyes was not the one who closed them. Within weeks, he declared himself a living god and demanded temples in his image. He forced senators to run alongside his chariot for miles, music, in their toggers. He ordered a floating bridge built across the Bay of Bay over 2 miles long just so he could ride across it wearing Alexander the Great's breastplate. The construction consumed ships needed for grain, music, transport. He revived the treason courts, the same courts that destroyed his family. And he began altering how the palace held music banquets. At first, Rome interpreted these as eccentricities, youthful excess, the arrogance of sudden power. But within months, the pattern clarified. Music. This wasn't instability. This was methodology. Banquets were not optional. Senators received word. The emperor requests your attendance. Bring your wife. Bring your daughters if they are of age. Refusal wasn't listed as an option because refusal didn't need to be forbidden. Everyone remembered what happened to families who disrespected Tiberius, so they came. The palace dining halls stretched over 300 feet. Couches lined the walls arranged. Music, by rank, slaves moved between them with wine fruit. Delicacies imported from Music, Egypt, and Gaul. Caligula reclined at the head and he watched. Not the food, not the entertainment. He watched the women. Ancient sources, music, describe what became routine. He would study a senator's wife across the room openly while her husband sat 3 couches away. Sometimes he commented loudly, comparing her to others, critiquing her appearance. Praising features and language meant to humiliate the man, not flatter the woman. Sometimes he gestured. Music, a servant approached, a quiet word. The woman stood because she had no choice and followed. The room continued eating. Conversation resumed. No one acknowledged what just happened because acknowledging it meant choosing. Object, music, and vanish or stay silent and survive. Rome chose survival every single time. Suetonius writes plainly, he lived in habitual incest with all his sisters, and at large banquets he placed each of them in turn below him, while his wife reclined music above. But the sisters weren't the only targets. Seneca, writing decades later, describes how Caligula publicly evaluated the wife of a consul, Polina, then removed her from the room. When she returned, the consul did not react. Cassius Dio records, he summoned the wives of men to the palace as if to honor them. Then, after examining them as though they were slaves for sale, he took whichever one he pleased. Sometimes he sent for husbands as well and forced them to witness. The phrase as if to honor them is key, because the summons came with music, pretense, a gift, a compliment, and imperial favor. Refusal was framed not as self-defense but as insult to the emperor. An insult to the emperor carried one penalty. Dio continues afterwards he would return to the banquet and openly discuss what had occurred, offering praise or criticism while the husbands were present. This wasn't secrecy. This was exhibition, music. The palace kept records. Secretaries documented attendance. Names were logged. Who came, who brought whom, who left early, and why. Pliny the Elder mentions these music records existed for decades, stored in the imperial archives until music were finally destroyed under the Flavian dynasty. But while they existed, they served a purpose. They turned every banquet into documentation. Attendance became complicity, and complicity became insurance for the emperor. Because men who had participated, who had watched, who had stayed silent could not later claim ignorance, they were witnesses. And witnesses to imperial crimes became accomplices, which meant they could never testify. Some men were rewarded. Afterward, given land titles, positions, music. Others were mocked, fined, exiled for failing to appreciate the honor. The randomness was structural. If punishment followed resistance, men could unite in refusal. But if punishment was arbitrary, if cooperation might bring reward or might bring nothing, then every man acted alone, isolated, silent. Survival became. Individual and collective resistance became impossible. Seneca describes the calculation. Men who had once commanded armies now measured their words at dinner, fearing that even agreement might be interpreted as conspiracy. In 39 AD, after uncovering a plot led by Gnaeus, Cornelius, Lentulus, Gotulus, Caligula didn't just execute the conspirators. He went after their families. Their wives were summoned to banquets. Their daughters were evaluated publicly. Then, weeks later, after humiliation had music settled, the men were formally charged with treason. By then, resistance was already broken. The accusation was just documentation, but Caligula also promoted one of the conspirators' cousins, gave him a command in Gerania. The message was clear. Loyalty to family could destroy you. Loyalty to the emperor could save you. Choose. Dio records that some senators, anticipating the pattern, sent their wives away to the countryside claiming illness or family obligation. Caligula responded by requiring proof, medical inspections, sworn testimony. If the women did not appear, the husbands were fined or stripped music of rank for disrespecting imperial hospitality. One senator, name lost to history, tried a different approach. He brought his wife to the banquet but seated her music. Between two older matrons, hoping visibility would provide protection, Caligula noticed. He commended the senator publicly, praised his devotion, then summoned all three women. When they returned, the senator was assigned music to inspect grain. Stores in Sardinia, a post that meant exile. His wife remained in Rome. The system was explicit. Your family attends or your career ends? And once music attended, they belonged to the palace. But some women didn't wait to be summoned. Lolia Paulina mentioned earlier didn't resist when called. Her family had paid fortunes for imperial favor before. She understood the trade. Seneca notes she arrived wearing emeralds worth 40 million sesterces, not as protest, as advertisement. Because in Caligula's palace, being chosen could be framed music to the outside world as political success. Families began including these imperial audiences in marriage negotiations. A daughter who had attended the emperor's private chambers could be marketed as having imperial favor. The humiliation was rebranded. Music and Rome's elite were willing to rebrand it because the alternative was admitting they had no power left at all. But violence alone doesn't explain compliance. Caligula understood that fear exhausts, that that even terror becomes routine. So he alternated punishment with reward. After a senator's wife was publicly taken, the senator might be promoted. After a daughter was removed from a banquet, the father might receive a lucrative grain contract. Foe of Alexandria describes watching this in person during his diplomatic visit to Rome. Men of consular rank stood outside the emperor's chambers, waiting, some in dread, some in hope. When their women emerged, they did not weep, they negotiated. The palace became a market. Excess to the emperor required offering what he wanted. And what he wanted was submission. Music demonstrated. Some families sent gifts in advance. Gold, slaves, estates in Campania. Others volunteered their daughters before being asked. The economy of the empire began reflecting this. Senators borrowed heavily to afford gifts that might win favor. Money. Lenders in the forum charged higher interest to families known to be in imperial disfavor. Entire fortunes were liquidated to pay for a single audience. And when those fortunes ran out, Caligula had a solution. He auctioned the property of men he executed, then invited the families' music of the executed to bid. If they refused to bid, they were accused of disrespecting the emperor's music generosity. If they bid, they purchased back their own stolen property at inflated prices. The treasury swelled and Rome stayed silent. Not every interaction was forced. Some families anticipated. In early 40 AD, a senator named Valerius Catulus divorced his wife. No reason given in the records, and remarried within a month. His new bride was 18, descended from an old patrician family, no political connections. 3 weeks after the wedding, Catulus brought her music to a palace banquet. She was seated near the emperor. Within an hour she was gone. When she returned, Catulus was granted a lucrative post overseeing the aqueducts. Dio records this without judgment, just documentation, but the implication is clear. Catulus had selected a bride knowing what the palace required, and she, whether she understood or not, had been married into compliance. This wasn't rare. Marriage contracts from this period begin including clauses, music about imperial obligations, legal language that allowed annulment if a wife failed to fulfill duties to the state. Rome had begun writing submission into law. The Praetorian music guards stood outside every banquet. They escorted the women to the emperor's chambers. They escorted them back. They saw everything and they said nothing because their role wasn't protection. It was enforcement. The Praetorians weren't loyal to Rome, they were loyal to payment. Caligula doubled their salary immediately after taking power. Music. He gave them bonuses during festivals. He armed them with the best equipment in the empire, and in exchange they upheld one rule. Whatever happens inside the palace stays inside the palace, but even financial loyalty has limits. By 40 AD, cracks formed. Cassius Carrier, a decorated Taurian tribune who had served under Germanicus, became a target of the emperor's mockery. Caligula questioned his manhood music publicly, gave him degrading passwords to repeat during guard rotations. Priapus' Venus pleasure forced him to kiss his hand in exaggerated submission during ceremonies. Ancient music sources describe Carrier as older, battle-hardened, respected among the ranks and visibly humiliated. He didn't object, but he stopped smiling. Other Taurians noticed Cornelius Sabinus, another tribune, had watched senators humiliated for months. He'd escorted women who left the emperor's chambers weeping. He'd stood guard while their husbands, music, pretended not to notice, and he'd collected his salary. But the passwords were different because the passwords were directed at them. The Praetorians were being told, "You are no different than the senators. You endure because I allow it." By late 40 AD, multiple plots existed. Senators whispered in private villas. Freedmen passed messages. But nothing moved because Caligula had built a system where individual resistance was suicide and collective action required trust. And trust required knowing who else would act. In a palace where informants were rewarded and silence was survival, no one knew. Carrier's conspiracy succeeded not because it was brilliant. It succeeded because it was small, 3 men, maybe 4. No grand speeches, no Senate involvement, just exhaustion. They didn't plan for months. They didn't recruit allies. They waited for a music opportunity. January 24th, 41 AD, the Palatine Games, thousands in attendance. Caligula left the theater through an underground corridor leading back to the palace. The Gerania bodyguard, his personal unit of towering German soldiers, accompanied him. Partway, music, then stopped because Carrier told them to. He was their superior officer. They obeyed. Chia and Cornelius Sabinus intercepted Caligula in the narrow passage. The sources described chaos. The first blow came from behind. Carrier's blade, music, struck between the shoulder and neck. Caligula fell, then the others joined. 30 stab wounds, some to the chest, some to the groin, some to the face. They didn't stop until he was unrecognizable. The German bodyguards heard the commotion. They rushed back, but by then Caligula was dead. In the confusion that followed, someone history doesn't agree who reached Caligula's chambers. His wife, Caesonia, was killed. His infant daughter, Julia Drusilla, was killed, her head smashed against a wall. Not as justice, as erasure. Because as long as Caligula's bloodline survived, someone might seek revenge, and no one wanted revenge. They wanted forgetfulness.